Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to look at the book Theorizing Patriarchy, which was written in 1990 by Sylvia Walby, and it's being discussed by Francine Sporenda. So thank you so much, Francine, and over to you.
From what I read, Sylvia Walby is still active. She's a sociologist. She's still teaching criminology at the Royal Holloway University of London. And she taught previously at the University of Leeds, Bristol University, Lancaster University, UCLA, and Harvard. And she's also the first UNESCO chair in gender research. And she has published 14 books, and 2 of these books deal with the topic of patriarchy. In her book, Theorizing Patriarchy, she examines the points of view of different feminist approaches on what patriarchy is, its main characteristics, how it's been evolving, as seen by radical feminism, Marxist feminism, and liberal feminism in particular. She asks a series of fundamental questions. What is the base of male supremacy according to this different feminism? Is it economic exploitation? It's a thesis of Marxist feminism, or is it the appropriation of female sexuality and reproductive capacity? Is it a material basis or an ideological basis? That's the point of view of cultural feminism. What is male violence? Is it just about a few individual males who are psychologically disturbed and can control their pulsions, like the dominant discourse pretends, or is it a primary instrument of male control over women? What is the source of the inequalities between men and women? Is it a byproduct of capital domination over labor, as Marxist feminists explain? Is it, like liberal feminists pretend, just a number of discriminations and attitudes which cannot be seen as part of a general structure? And what is the relation between capitalism and patriarchy? Are they separate entities which are interconnected, or are they one and the same? Capitalism being just the last form of patriarchy, like Maria Mies says. About this last question, Walby mentioned the dual system theory. There is an interconnection between the two systems when it comes to the situation of women. On the one hand, they tend to reinforce each other. Women are at a disadvantage in the workplace because when they are coupled with a man, they have to do domestic work, which makes it impossible for them to invest their whole energy and time in their job, like men can do. Since they are disadvantaged at work and getting paid less than men, as a result, they have to seek a coupling with a man for financial reasons. It's a sort of a catch-22 situation. Please, can I have the slide number 1? Feminists have been discussing if the two systems are fused in one or interacting but separate. Obviously, patriarchy predates capitalism by thousands of years. Walby mentioned the position of Heidi Hartman, who wrote several books on this question, one in particular titled The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism. Hartman underlines that the expropriation of women's work by men is not new and not specific to capitalist societies, but capitalism benefits from a particular form of family which ensures the cheap reproduction of labor power and the availability of women as a reserve army of labor. Capitalism needs patriarchal relations to survive. On the other hand, there are also tensions between capitalism and patriarchy. Capitalism, being interested in low-wage workers, has an interest in bringing women outside the home into factories, offices, and shops, and paying them reduced salaries, giving them a sort of incomplete financial independence and offering them a way out of the confinement of the home and an escape from the control of their individual patriarchs. So capitalism both exploits women and liberates them. In his landmark book, The Origin of the Family of Private Property and the State, published in 1884, A short time after Marx's death, Engels wrote that women could only be liberated by their entry in the workforce. Even if the word patriarchy was not used with its present meaning during the 19th century, several thinkers got interested in the study of male dominance and developed questions and hypotheses about it. Did it always exist? If not, when did it come about? What were the material or cultural causes that could have caused its appearance? And are there societies which are not organized around it? The first of these thinkers who tried to think out these questions were Johann Jakob Bachhofen and Henry Lewis Morgan, whose books inspired Engels and Marx. I cannot avoid mentioning the names of these men because they proposed ideas and theories about patriarchy that were revolutionary for their time, even from a feminist point of view. And Walby discusses these authors extensively in her book. Bachhofen was a Swiss jurist born in 1815 in Bâle, in a well-off family. He studied law at German University, and at 26 became professor of Roman law at the University of Bâle. His knowledge of Roman and Greek history in the context of the interest of the historian of his time for mythologies, the discovery of Sanskrit and the hypothesis of an Indo-European culture led it to give up his position at the Bâle University to redirect his interest towards the study of antique graves, mythologies, and Greek and Roman religions. This interest for the origins of humanity led him to the question, was humanity always organized as it is now around men dominating women, or was this domination of men over women a historical, relatively recent phenomenon? This is what his book Das Mutterrecht, Mother Right, published in 1861, is about. It's a very interesting and intellectually daring book, which for this very reason was received with serious reservation by German historians as too speculative. Its main thesis that Bachhofen draws from his study of antique mythology is that before the present system of male dominance, another type of society existed, which was matrilinear, where kinship was organized in a totally different manner, with a totally different logic, on the principle that women were the creators of life, men being only creatures. And since there was no monogamous marriage, fatherhood could not exist, as a man could not know if a child was his. And for this reason, bloodline and inheritance could only be from mother to daughter. These pre-agricultural societies function on different principles and laws, and he opposes their community right based on the feminine attitude of communal sharing, giving to each his own, and of organic natural right to individual and state right based on egoism, so-called reason and abstraction, which he sees as breaking our original fusional relation with nature and with other members of the group. Can I have slide number 2, please? So he writes, woman comes first, a man only comes from her. He writes, reversing the biblical narrative. What is important about Bachhofen's work is that he proposes that the family and male dominance as we know them are the result of a historical evolution. They have not always existed in their present state, and neither private property. He develops this idea that the family and men's power are not natural, quite the opposite. Therefore, they are not unchangeable. Another idea that he develops is that the first form of right, the first form of human culture, have not been produced by males, contrary to what was thought at the time, but in particular theory of the man the hunter during the 20th century, he states emphatically that mother love is the relation that inaugurates the process of human civilization, and that motherhood creates a different kind of link of an affective nature, which is the basis of the first form of right. By the first form of right, he refers to the clanic rules of kinship that regulate human behavior in this type of early societies. He insists repeatedly on the fact that motherhood is a reality, whereas fatherhood is a fiction, a political abstraction. What he says is important because during the 19th century, particularly, as Gerda Lerner writes in her book, The Majority Finds Its Past, it's assumed that man is a measure of significance, so that the activities of men are seen as inherently more significant than the activities of women. War and politics are seen as more significant to the history of humankind than child rearing. So even if he's somewhat essentialist, Bach often says the opposite. In the beginning was the mother, her children, the children of her children, the clan. And he considered that our present societies cannot be understood if we don't go back to their origins. If patriarchy did not always exist, the big question is, how did it happen? What made it happen? Henry Louis Morgan is another of these thinkers whose ideas opened doors. He was American, also a lawyer, and studied Iroquois societies, the Seneca tribe in particular. He was adopted by the Seneca. In his book Ancient Society, he describes them as having kinship systems completely different from the Western ones. These societies are composed of matrilineal families and clans in which women have more power, a lot more power than in Western societies. The very first feminist conference took place in Seneca Falls in 1848, and the customs of the Iroquois were an inspiration for its participants. Slide 3, please. In his book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Friedrich Engels took the reflection on the situation of women further than Marx. To him, the basis of women's oppression is in the family, and the oppression of women as a material basis, which is double, production and reproduction. He sees reproduction as having been number one in prehistoric times, when the intervention of men in women's pregnancy was not known. Hence, a system of matriarchy must have existed because women were seen as the sole creators of children. Then matriarchy was overthrown by the development of production and the creation of economic surpluses, which became a source of conflict and division between people, thus triggering the apparition of classes and wars. The male class who controls these surpluses instituted monogamy to transmit the property of these surpluses to children who were guaranteed to be theirs by the forced monogamy of the wives. So in his view, private property preceded monogamy and was the cause of the subjugation of women. Walby observes that Engels appears to have confused matrilineal societies in which descent is traced to women, but in which men still have control, with matriarchal societies in which women have control. Some cultures can be matrilineal and patriarchal. She underlines that contrary to Engels' assertion, the women were not liberated by their entry in the workforce, and she wonders why. One reason is that Marxism considered that the basis of women exploitation is purely economic. There are very few mentions of male violence against women in Marxist text. As I remember, there are a few about wife beating, which they explain like it was typical during the 19th century by drunkenness, or the frustration of male workers exploited by capitalism. As I remember, beside that, there are only references to prostitution, which Marxists did not see, unlike today's feminism, as a violent practice per se, just as exploitative and degrading for the John as well as for the women. There is also no Marxist acknowledgement of the fact that proletarian women are not only exploited by the capitalists they work for, but also by the proletarian men they are coupled with. To Engels, there could not be any exploitation of women in a proletarian family. Because the proletarian owns nothing, therefore no exploitation is possible. The proletarian owns nothing, his relation with his wife and children have nothing in common with those of the bourgeois family, writes Engels. According to him, only the bourgeois wife is exploited by her husband. In his wife, a bourgeois is only an instrument of production. Walby observed that Engels' view that there is no exploitation of the wife in proletarian families is empirically wrong. The domestic work of the proletarian wife benefits her husband first, and of course capitalists also, but indirectly, because her unpaid work is necessary for her husband, so he can do his job. Capitalism could not function without the cleaning, cooking, and care of the proletarian wife. And on top of that, the burden of domestic work is usually heavier for the proletarian wife than for the bourgeois wife. There is a naturalization of the sexual division of labor in most Marxist writings, but Engels is getting a tad closer to modern feminist analysis than Marx. On the topic of women's domestic work. On this topic, Walby also mentioned the work of Christine Delphi, which deals extensively with domestic work. In the couple, Delphi sees the housewife as the producing class, and the husbands as a non-producing class expropriating the labor of their wives. She considered that classes exist in the domestic mode of production, which is excluded from Marxist analysis in a manner similar to the other modes of production covered by Marxism. Housework is as much production as any other form of work, she writes, and she sees the economy as combining the patriarchal mode of production, which takes place in the family, with the capitalist mode of production, which takes place outside. She mentions the main criticism made to Delphi, economism, which means that she neglects the non-economic form of oppression. Also, Walby remarks that in Marxist analysis, there is no mention of the fact that women move in and out of jobs in relation to their family life and also to their husband's job, and that a woman's social class is determined by her association with the men in her life, father and husband. And that's because in the Marxist view, class is strictly determined by her position in the relation of production, which don't include domestic work. Walby remarks that the basic question of feminist theory is what is the basis, the core of women's oppression? For Delphi and Shulamit Firestone, there is a material basis for women's oppression. As a result, sexism is not just a cultural phenomenon that can be overcome by educating men, which is more a position of liberal feminism. Men get material benefits from their domination of women, and these benefits are economic, mainly for Delphi. For Shulamit Firestone, the basis of women's oppression is women's capacity to reproduce, and the handicaps and limitation that this capacity entails. Pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, and childcare, which make women vulnerable and dependent on men. That's why she has been accused of biological essentialism. For her, reproduction is more important than production. For Brown-Miller, the basis of female oppression is rape, male violence. For Edwin Rich, it's institutionalized heterosexuality. For Marxism, women's oppression stems from capitalism and should disappear when capitalism is overthrown. Another important distinction developed in Walby's book is that when it comes to deciding if patriarchy is regressing or not, it's very important to differentiate changes in degree and changes in form. Very often, even feminists confuse the two. Our view is that there has been an evolution from private patriarchy to a public form of patriarchy. The private patriarchy was based on household production, women weaving, sewing, etc., and the home being the main site of women's oppression under the control of their own individual patriarch. In modern society, the main site of women's oppression is public. It's employment and the state, and it's a collective form of appropriation. And of course, the role of women in home and family is a handicap in their position of paid work. It's called a double shift. She notices also that it's not because women are now overall more qualified than men in lots of countries and have more diplomas that it corresponds necessarily to higher salaries. We all know it's not the case. Walby's explanation is that it's because in the professional world, decisions about promotions, pay raise, etc., are made in male networks which are close to women. This is contrary to Marxist views, which is a situation of workers entirely determined by capitalist relations. Walby describes the relation between private and public patriarchy. She mentioned that women who have children are rarely able to earn enough money to stay above poverty line. For these women, and even for women who don't have children, getting out of a bad marriage means usually falling into poverty, which means having to rely on welfare. This is a typical case of the move from private patriarchy, being kept financially by a man, to public patriarchy, counting on financial aid from the state to take care of yourself and your children. She said that working class mothers sometimes consider it more advantageous to depend financially on the state than on a man. She recalled that having a wife who doesn't work and takes care of the family's needs and earning a family wage to be able to keep her at home was once seen as a condition to achieve full masculinity for a man. She adds that family wage never really existed. It was just a way to justify higher male wages. Nowadays, only a minority of women are full-time housewives, and she sees a flight from domesticity for women, along with a flight from fatherhood in men. The flight from domesticity for women could be seen as a change in degree for patriarchy, a setback for male dominance, but to her, it's mostly a change in form. She sees the modern definition of femininity as not so much based on domesticity anymore, but on sexual attractiveness. What is required nowadays from women is different, but it's still defined relatively to men's needs and desires. Walby quotes the definition of heterosexuality by Rich, a type of relation where women emotionally and materially, as well as sexually, service men. And she adds that women support men more than men support women, in particular when it comes to emotional support, for which women can only count on other women. In a heterosexual relationship, women have their own special oppressor, and this relation impedes the possibility of ties with other women. In order to survive this situation of oppression, women adopt at least partially the point of view of their oppressor and collaborate with the male dominant class. The observation that women who are independent from men are more likely to unite politically to oppose male oppression leads to the notion of necessary separatism to get away from men in order to develop a non-patriarchal form of thinking as the basis of valid political action. Contradiction in respect to the employment of women, we have seen that there is a contradiction between capitalists who want to take women outside the household and into factories, workshops, and offices, and traditional patriarchy who wants to keep them at home under the control of the male head of the family. This contradiction has been solved, underlines Walby, by the patriarchal regulation that organize the presence of women in public places of employment. At first, women were judged undesirable in places where men worked, and the trade unions of the 19th century, up to the middle of the 20th century, fought to keep them out. In the end, capitalism won, but if women were finally admitted in public places of work, it's on the basis of a segregation in the types of jobs seen as female jobs, which are usually the continuation of the service work they do in the home. The move was from exclusion to segregation. And Walby mentioned the problem of sexual harassment at work that she sees as a way to keep women away from male jobs. She observed that the figures of sexual harassment of women at work are about double in the area of non-traditional female jobs as in the area of typical female jobs. Another topic for which the question of form or degree can be asked is sexual liberation, that some call sexual liberalization or sexual revolution. The liberal view is that it's all good for women. The conservative view is that it's bad, not just for the family, but for women as well, since they can find security only in a stable marriage. The reasons provided by liberals to justify their positive evaluations of the sexual liberation is that the double standard for women was eliminated, which is only very partially true. Contraception and abortion became widely available, which facilitate women's sexual activity. There is more tolerance for homosexuality, a bit more visibility for lesbians, and less censorship overall. Marxist feminists don't have much to say about that. The radical feminist position is that thanks to the sexual liberation, women have been more completely incorporated into active heterosexuality, which they see as a new form of control by men. Walby underlines that the feminists of the 19th century were not so enthusiastic about sex. One of their slogans proposed by Emmeline Pankhurst was "Vote for women, chastity for men." It was imposing to men the female chastity standards. The sexual liberation, says Walby, has imposed on women males' non-chastity standards. She underlines rightly that there is now considerable pressure for women to engage in sex in a way unknown to 19th century women, and that at this time, women were not expected to like or want to engage in sex. For Sheila Jeffreys, the sexual revolution is a counter-revolution. And indeed, its negative effects are considerable. Of course, porn, is the most obvious. But one might consider that the transgender movement is a sexual liberation last side effect. As I mentioned before, in the dominant discourse, violence is seen as individually motivated and resulting from psychological causes, traumatizing childhood experience, dysfunctional families, etc. Radical feminists consider that male violence cannot be considered outside an analysis of patriarchal social structures. Walby quotes a study conducted on 12 incarcerated rapists. All report a difficult childhood. They didn't have the motherly love, the stability and attention that children need. Because of rejection and abandonment, they could not construct a normal form of masculinity. They were unable to develop normal relations with women. According to the author of the study, rape was triggered by stress, but the deeper cause was that they were trying to reaffirm their masculinity. This thesis is problematic. The majority of rapists are not considered as needing psychiatric care by the courts. The figure given by Walby is that only 3.5 rapists are referred to psychiatric hospitals by the courts. In fact, the psychological profile of most rapists appears normal. She mentioned that the same theory exists for wife beating. Men beat up their wife because they saw their father beat up their mother when they were children. But studies on wife beating show that not all men who saw their father beat their mother beat their wife. And not all men who beat their wife saw their father beat their mother. Walby reminds us that the explanations of male violence have changed over time. During the first wave, it was mostly attributed to drinking. And she underlines that the final abolition of the husband's legal right to beat his wife or rape her was just a partial transfer of the right of the individual patriarch to exert violence on women to the state. Because when a woman reports a rape to the police, usually a process of re-victimization ensues, she is not believed, the investigations are not conducted thoroughly, so the case cannot be substantiated. The level of proof also is very high. It's more a shift in the locus of control than its elimination. And the paradox of male violence is that for protection against male violence, women become dependent upon the very people, men they know, who are the most likely source of violence against them. The Marxist position on male violence is that it happens in men stressed by the situations of exploitation and oppression in which they live. They are unemployed or overworked, they feel emasculated, so they lash out on their wife. Walby mentioned that his point of view is apparently backed by numbers. The percentage of male violent behaviors in blue-collar families is about twice as much as in white-collar families. But more rapes or assaults by blue-collar men or immigrants are reported to the police, and the police believes women more when they report blue-collar violence. And Walby asks, why these men lash out on women and not on men? The ultimate argument that closes the case is if stress, violence, and aggressions in childhood are the causes of violence, then women should be the more violent sex, which is not the case, as violent crime is essentially a male affair. The Marxist view is that the state mediates only between social classes, but it's wrong. The state mediates also between men and women, abortion, contraception, access of women to work, etc. An essential form of state mediation between men and women is its non-intervention against male violence, thus giving evidence of its patriarchal character. The old form of patriarchy is private. The woman works in the home under the control of an individual patriarch, and the new form of patriarchy is mostly public. Concretely, it means that there is a reduced dependence on husbands and an increased dependence on the state. An important date in this transition from private to public patriarchy has been the institution of modern divorce, which was done in the UK by the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. Women were thus given the possibility of living a violent marriage, whereas before, their submission to their husband was absolute and almost unescapable. Their properties and wages belonged to him from the day they got married. He had the right to beat them, to sequestrate them, and of course, the right to rape them. But the financial protection that the husband was supposed to bring to his wife became provisional. Still today, divorce means a fall into poverty for quite a few women, then having to be on welfare. Is divorce a change of patriarchy in degree or just in form? Probably both, but maybe more in form than in degree. Because for one thing, women are still not on an equal footage with men in the professional sphere. In particular, they are still hampered professionally by domestic work and motherhood. When a divorce takes place, they are still the ones who assume most of the care of the children. Even when there is shared custody, it's seldom a 50-50 situation. They continue to do lots of the work they did when they were married, and there is often a constant haggling over the children. Walby notes that even when public childcare is available, this type of work is totally done by women. She notes also that capitalism has accentuated the sexual division of labor when the work done by males started to take place outside the household, in workshops, shops, and factories, while the wife stayed home. The housewife is an invention of modern capitalism. Of course, the sexual division of labor did not start with capitalism, but it perpetuates it. There are still lots of jobs which are almost exclusively feminine. Where I live, for instance, supermarkets cashiers are almost exclusively female. I don't remember seeing a male cashier. And it's well known that when women manage to enter male jobs in high numbers, it's because men no longer find these jobs financially attractive. The exclusion of women from male working places had been replaced by segregation. Is it a change of patriarchy in form or degree? In conclusion, what I found interesting in this book, besides the question of the relation between patriarchy and capitalism, is a number of its theories, in particular that patriarchy's change in degree and in form should not be confused. In fact, very often you see in the media that patriarchy has disappeared, that it's a thing of the past. The patriarchy, which has partially disappeared, is 19th century private patriarchy, but it's been progressively replaced by neo-patriarchy, public patriarchy, as a consequence of women having entered the workforce and getting some rights. But this has not led to their emancipation from men's control. Only the control is implemented by different means. Okay, are there any questions?
Well, I've got a question, and which is that it's very nice to read a book that was written in, was it 1990, before all this gender, postmodernist, post-feminism ideas. That it sort of seems to be rooted in material reality. What do you think about that? Is that right, that it's before postmodernism?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think, it can be called no, it's really before, something that was written before what the question is talking about, really.
It's good that you introduced this book, because I mean, I haven't read it for a very, very long time. So, but it makes me think many things when you're talking about it. Of course, that she goes through all the basic understandings of Marxism and Marxist feminism from the early days and so on. I remember all the discussions about that in the 1970s. And she also adds in what was never discussed then, which is the problem of violence against women and control of women through sexuality. So that's good. But mainly what I think about it is, yes, we had all of that. And what the hell have we got now? Because since then, there's been the massive backlash against feminism. All kinds of feminism, in fact. And now I do feel there's extremely little hope, because what we're doing is fighting a rearguard action to keep any of the things that we ever had going. And so I guess it makes me kind of sad in a way, which I guess it shouldn't. Yes, 30 years ago, there were all of those understandings. Now, there's not really any women's studies in universities. These ideas are not understood and so on. It's such a different time. And I can't imagine now a book being written like Theorizing Patriarchy. And that's very, very sad to think, because we're all just desperately struggling to even be allowed to have our own toilets at this time. So I don't know, really. Did you feel that when you were reading the book, that it was kind of bad the way we
Yes, I
are
mean,
now?
it's a book which is dated, and I don't think there is a lot of interest nowadays about patriarchy. Analyzing it and trying to understand how it works. I think it's the main work on this topic was done, and of course by historical feminists, during the 70s and 80s, and probably it stopped, or it went really. It was really a trickle, after that. I mean, and really, I don't think many women are interested in analyzing patriarchies nowadays.
No, and that's a puzzle, really. Does that mean that they don't think that there is a system that we need to analyze? We only need to fight these rearguard battles? Or or is it just that it's been expunged from the universities? Because when she was writing in 1990, feminism was doing well in universities. But maybe it was kind of at its high point before it got driven out of universities later on. And it's certainly not there now. And young people are not finding feminism. And we have no contact with the few feminists who might be there. Their books are not popular. Generally, feminists are not reading them. They're seen as very sort of separate, very academic. I don't know. It's a sad situation, Francine. I don't have an answer to that, really. Obviously, you and I, and probably all of us here, want to understand patriarchy, or I call it male domination, because I see patriarchy as a sort of weasel word, really. It's not to do with fathers from my point of view. But we all want that general analysis of patriarchy, which she's trying to do for us. And it's just not happening. I don't really have a question, only to say that the whole session makes me feel a little sad in that respect as to what we had. But I understand that you are writing about it all again.
When I talk about patriarchy with women who are really not very well informed on feminism, very often the answer is it's gone, it's finished, it's a thing of the past. And of course, what is very interesting is to see the new forms that it takes. And a lot of women are not aware of the changes in patriarchy. They think it's really finished because for them, patriarchy is what happened during the 19th century. Mm-hmm. But, you know, of course, they don't realize that ideology has replaced constraint. And they think they are free from it now. Very often.
Can you explain that? What do you mean by ideology has replaced constraint?
Instead of, well, of course, you well know, you know, of course, that during the 19th century, married women were absolutely, you know, so slaves, you know, to the husband. The husband controlled their money, their wages. He could beat them up, he could sequestrate them, and so forth and so on. That direct constrained by force and the law. Now it's the control of women goes mostly through ideology, which is a discourse, which is not a constraint, but just things, you know, modes of behaviors which are proposed to women as normal, that they should adopt because it's better for them and so on. You know, there's this fundamental difference between constraint, including by violence. That I don't mean that violence against women is finished, but there is now an indirect control, which is by ideology, you know, telling them that, for instance, you know, the married life is wonderful, that you can only be happy if you are heterosexual and in a relationship and so forth and so on. So it's not constraint, that, you know, it's ideology.
Except that violence against women is still a very, very serious form of constraint.
Of course.
And the great majority of women have various forms of constraint exercised upon them in their relationships with men, even if it's the silent treatment and not actual physical violence and shouting and so on. So women are very much controlled by that violence and by fear in the streets and at the workplace of what men may do to them. So there is still huge force involved in the control of women. So I don't think it is just ideology, in fact.
But lots of women nowadays have the feeling to be free, that because of this, the most severe form of controls are gone, or less important than during the 19th century, that they are free. They don't see themselves as controlled, you know.
I mean, I would add also that we don't really have Marxist organizations now. So, for instance, in Britain, the Labour Party has stopped being Marxist and they've stopped using the Marxist analysis or that Welby's been was arguing against, and we were comparing a radical feminist view to the Marxist view. That Marxist view's gone, and that's, I think, partly changes the debate, because we are now not criticizing, as feminists, we're not criticizing the Marxists, we're criticizing the progressives. Well, currently we're progressing, where I think we are criticizing ideology more directly, in terms of criticizing transgender ideology. So I think that the players on the political scene of who are oppressing women have slightly changed their positions. So that's very interesting. Yeah.
You think that Marxist feminism is completely gone? I mean, it might be the case in the UK, but it's still a little, still exists. It's not big in France. I don't mean it's big, but it still exists. I have a few friends who are Marxist feminists.
I think France might be a little different, and South America and Spain even. I think in Britain that it's been, you know, completely got rid of, really, Marxism on the left, any idea of socialism. You never hear a discussion of socialism in this country. I mean, it would be completely seen as, you know, ridiculous, I think. I do think there's a particular change here, but in the Anglophone world, not necessarily in the Francophone world, not in the Spanish-speaking world, and so on.
Also, which is, you know, one trend of feminism which is going strong in France is cultural feminism. I have a lot of feminist friends on social networks that say it's all a matter of re-educating men properly. They are wrong, but they don't know that they are wrong. They don't know that they are doing, you know, harm to women. It's because they are not conscious of that, you know. And our task as feminists is to re-educate them. And of course, you know, I absolutely don't agree with that, but I have to fight this notion very often when I am on social networks.
One question that sort of piggybacks on the first question that Joe asked and what you just said is that, yeah, this, I mean, you know, this was written at a time before postmodernism became completely a juggernaut. If you were gonna, and now we, you know, which is actually, I think, when Sex and the City first came out, and now you've got women saying, well, patriarchy has nothing to do with men. If you were going to provide some kind of remedial introduction to being able to even understand what's in this book, where would you start with all these women who just like don't get it, and you know, and don't even know how much they're influenced by postmodernism? Where would you start? What is the starting point for getting, for you know, I don't know if it's some kind of magic incantation, as it were, academically or socially. I mean, where would you start?
Well, the concept I found most interesting in this book are the opposition between a change in degrees and change in form of patriarchy, because very often feminists confuse the two. And again, as I mentioned, there's a feeling of being liberated, whereas in fact, it's only the form of patriarchy that changed. And also the change from private patriarchy to public patriarchy is very interesting. The fact that now some women, the poor women in particular, might not be financially dependent on men, but they are dependent on welfare and therefore the state. And for instance, also the notion of the fact that women have been admitted in public places of work only of which they were excluded you know, during the 19th century mostly, only on the basis of segregation. You know, they have been parked, so to speak, in female jobs. And still, if you look at the main form of an employment that are in which female work now, it's mostly very often service jobs. So there is a continuation of what they do in the home. And it's still the case for a majority of women. So in this respect, you know, it's an important notion, this difference between the fact that, you know, the change, the evolution from exclusion to segregation. It's very important also to understand women, you know, women's employment.
You know, I don't know if it's apocryphal, but there are stories of how Harriet Tubman and then I think Audre Lorde quoted it. If they only knew that they were slaves, I could free so many more women if they only knew that they were slaves. And I don't know where to start with telling somebody that, oh, by the way, you've been completely taken in and enslaved no matter how you feel. I kind of start sometimes with saying, you know, how you feel is not what you are.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I don't remember because I read the book a long time ago, but I presume she doesn't mention beauty practices in the book, the importance of women's appearance. No, because to me, the very clearest illustration of the fact that women are still totally unfree is high heels and makeup. The fact that women have to do these dreadful and crippling practices and practices of deference upon their persons. I mean, I was just watching the Notre Dame celebration thing last night, and the women, particularly the wives of politicians and so on, stick thin in incredibly high shoes, unable to walk. It all was just a terrible demonstration of the extraordinary inequality between men and women. Now, it seems to me that is something we're still really, although we try to talk about it on this channel, as it were, we're not really supposed to mention. But it's so blooming obvious how anybody could not notice high-heeled shoes. To me, is absolutely extraordinary. And that is, of course, hugely more important now than it was even in 1990. So much more enforced and so much more obvious and so much more terrible now.
I think also, if you look at the media and the state institutions or some of the mainstream institutions, them promoting woman face in terms that, which is your term, Sheila, the drag queens, I think is similar. They're culturally imposing, which links up to what you've been saying, a form of patriarchy, which is a cultural patriarchy, perhaps that's the term, instead of promoting Che Guevara or some revolutionary hero like Arthur Scargill, some lefty Lenin or whatever, the Trotskyists. But now they're promoting this new form of patriarchy, and that's being promoted by the state rather than in a horrific way. But yeah, she doesn't mention any of that really. So we're really in very different times, although it's useful thinking.
But she mentions extensively the sexual liberation. And what she says about it, I think it's interesting. You know, the fact that during the feminists of the 19th century tried to impose on men females' chastity standard, and the sexual revolution has been exactly the opposite. I think it's an interesting point of view. And also, I think, you know, really maybe the main concept, you know, that I find, you know, the most interesting is the difference between change in degree and change in form. That's really important, because it's really something that traps a lot of women into thinking that there is absolutely no longer any patriarchy, you know, because it has changed form. So I think that's maybe, sorry, I have a hiccup, definitely. Maybe the main contribution of the book.
Yes, and I noticed somebody did point out in the chat that it's poor and working class women who are most horrendously affected by the practices, blowing up the face and doing terrible things to the body, crippling the fingers, or all of that sort of stuff. It's most particularly severe for precisely the women that once upon a time socialist feminists would have been concerned about, it's fair to say.
One other point out is that American radical feminism, there was almost no socialist feminism at all. I mean, there were, there were women who became involved in socialism and just joined separate sort of, labor type movements, but were really on the periphery, if at all, involved in radical feminism. So I don't know if you can speak to how this, translates to, to the United States, where Marxism, socialism was just non-existent in radical feminism, and any mention of it basically just gets you turned off as, oh, you're just a commie, or that doesn't apply here.
Definitely, it's more a concern of British feminism, indeed, than American feminism. Yeah.
Well, we've come to 11 o'clock, so thank you so much to Francine, and thank you for Sheila Jeffries and Marion Rotiliano for joining, and thanks everybody for being here. And hopefully you'll come back on, Francine, and tell us about your book and or other books next year.
Yes, thanks very much, Francine. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Francine. That was great.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Okay, bye everybody.